Okay, so let's get started. Bonjour, I wish to acknowledge my spirit name, Love Eagle, from the Caribou clan in recognition of the treaty territory that I have the privilege of living and working on, Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. So I would like to welcome everyone. This is the Missing and Murdered Women and Girls Two-Spirit Plus LGBTQIA Urban Sub-Working Group report to our sister urban Indigenous organizations, governments, and other key stakeholders. So happy that you're all here today joining us. To begin our time together, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sheila Swanson, President and founding member of the National Aboriginal Circle Against Family Violence, for our land acknowledgement. Sheila, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Well, Diane. Warm greetings to all, elders, urban sub-working group members, members of the Secretariat, federal government representatives, RCMP, provincial government representatives, Indigenous governments, urban Indigenous organizations, and community members from across Canada. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon which time zone you are joining us from today. It is almost noon in the Pacific Coast, and it's already afternoon in the Atlantic East Coast. So welcome to the Urban Sub-Working Group Information Session, where we will unveil our work that we have been doing around the National Action Plan, the Urban Pathway to End Violence for MMIWG2S LGBTQIA+ people, and our plan to move forward. My name is Sheila Swanson. My spirit name is Thunder Woman, a name given to me by my elders in ceremony. I am from the Mi'kmaq Nation, and today I am joining you from my community of Listuguj in Geskabegawagi, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki. Just before going live, I prepared and burned my smudge, offering prayers and good thoughts for a successful gathering today and for all our communities, rural and urban, across the land, and prayers for peace. I raise my smudge for you. For over a year and a half, over 60 sessions, the Urban Sub-Working Group, comprising of empowering and inspiring Indigenous women who are leaders in their respectful fields from across Canada, met regularly through a virtual platform. Before the beginning of each session, time was allotted for each of us to acknowledge the land, the territory from which we came from, declaring our connection to the land, to the territory, to the people. A land acknowledgement before anything and everything else. It set the tone for our meetings and our connection to each other and the work that was before us. Please take a moment to acknowledge the territory you are currently on. Today, we honor our Indigenous sisters from across our nation and celebrate our diverse and vibrant cultures, languages, ceremonies, and shared values and visions, and the natural laws throughout our traditional territories from coast to coast to coast. We acknowledge the lands, the water, air, and fires from our traditional territories today and always. We honor and recognize our matriarchs and ancestors who have protected and cared for our communities, our traditional teachings, and our responsibility for creation that made it possible for all of us to be here today, and for us to share our work, the urban path to reclaiming power and place, regardless of residency, and to amplify the urban voice. Walalia, thank you in all my relations.
Thank you so much, Sheila. So next I'll be your moderator. My English name is Diane Redsky, and I live and work in Winnipeg, Manitoba for a very special organization called the MMIWG2S Center. And one of my biggest jobs is to be a cookum to Annabelle, who is in school right now. So just some technical housekeeping. So this is a webinar. It's going to be recorded so that we can share this with anyone who hasn't been able to make it today. This event will offer both translated into French and English, and that button is on the bottom of your screen, interpretation. And so when you click that, you pick the either English or French when we get to that point for full translation. We will also be offering trauma supports for this session, and I refer you to the chat room for that really important information. We will also be posting important information in the chat throughout the session, including how to access trauma supports, but also where to get our reports and other vital information that we would like to pass on to you. I'd like to especially thank the National Association of Friendship Centers, who really helped us pull all together the technical and logistics components of this meeting for this webinar today. Thank you so much. To be honest, I couldn't have done this without you, and just so appreciate your help with this session today. We are happy to share this PowerPoint, and so there'll be an email address at the end of this at the end of the slideshow. At the end, the last slide will be our email address, and you can just email us and we'll be happy to send you a copy. There will be an opportunity for you to put your questions in the Q&A button. So that's different from the chat. And we will do our best to answer as many questions in this session. And at the end of this session, so you can ask your question anytime, but we will get to the questions at the end. We'd also like to ask that when you're putting a question in, if there is someone specific you would like to answer that question, that will help us out knowing who you would like to hear from. You can also put comments in the chat if it's not a question, so feel free, that is open and is being monitored as well. And today's session will be about 90 minutes, an hour and a half, and can go, we booked the 2 hours in case we needed to go to the 2 hours. And then the last slide will be your email address, which we really strongly encourage everyone to reach out so that we can stay in touch with everyone. So before I begin the formal part of my presentation on the background, we'd like to acknowledge the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit LGBTQIA families and survivors across our territories, and for the families that continue to seek justice. It is your voice and the voice of generations of families and survivors who never gave up to be heard, respected, treated equitably, and to be secure and safe. Your strong and powerful voice made the National Inquiry in Canada happen. Thank you, Miigwech. We are very grateful for your voice and making that happen from all of us. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today's session is called Walking the Urban Path to MMIWG2S Plus Action Plan Implementation. I'd also like to acknowledge our other urban sub-working group members who are not present or are not presenting today, but they're online and they're here in support. And I'd like to ask you to draw your attention to the invite so you can have a full list of who all of those powerful members are and a little bit more about the skills and the strengths that they bring to the urban sub-working group. So the Missing and Murdered Urban Sub-Working Group has been incredibly busy since our first meeting in July 2020. And we are looking forward to sharing with you today a few things. Our work leading up to the MMIWG2S Plus Urban National Action Plan. What is in the Urban National Action Plan. How we took our Urban National Action Plan and then created the next step and developed an implementation plan, and our work moving forward that will have many, many opportunities for more urban Indigenous organizations to be engaged, all for the purposes of amplifying and maximizing our voices when it comes to service delivery for our urban Indigenous relatives. Time permitting, we will answer as many questions as possible. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is just a quick background, and I won't go through this whole slide here. This slide is an overview of the National Inquiry report that was completed and shared with all of Canada on June 3rd, 2019. And this concluded some really important, not only the 231 calls for justice, the 4 pathways to end genocide, and the 7 principles of change, but also concluded that human rights of Indigenous and Indigenous rights abuses and violations committed and condoned to the Canadian state represent genocide. And so that was a really important part of what really inspired our work. Next slide. So this next slide is about the Call for Justice 1.1, creating the National Action Plan. So this began for our urban sub-working group in June 2020. Although behind the scenes work was occurring before this time in many provinces, territories, federal and Indigenous, First Nation, Inuit, Métis governments, and in communities leading up to this National Action Plan process. And again, some more than others, depending where you are across the country, and certainly in the lives and hearts and minds of MMIWG2S plus families and survivors. So you'll see in this graphic, there's leadership from, firstly, the National Families and Survivors Circle at its core. This is a critical part of the process because this is their rightful place to guide, direct, and inform the process of the national, regional, and local levels. There was also all levels of government, including Indigenous, First Nation, Inuit, Métis governments. And then there were 3 specialized groups, sub-working groups, where there was an opportunity to fill some really important gaps that the National Inquiry had. The first one is the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ sub-working group. And this is to restore the Two-Spirit people's rightful place in our traditional governance systems. The second working group is the data sub-working group. So we all know that there are significant flaws in the current way data and research is being collected on our people, on Indigenous people, and used to inform the way systems are set up. So we know that this is a real problem, and it's contributing to and responsible for directly creating risk and vulnerability for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA. We see a critical opportunity for data sovereignty. The third working group is urban, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but not yet. Just I have a couple more points to make. There is a link on this slide so you can read each of the national action plans and identify unique solutions and implementation plans based on their role and responsibility to MMIWG2S plus and their territory. So you can click on any one of those components within the circle, and it'll take you right to their national action plan. So there is not only one solution or one way to achieve better outcomes. What matters is how people are supported to determine and lead their own solutions. So before I move on to the next slide, just want to let you know that all of these working groups continue their work on implementation at all levels of government, have responded with infrastructure and funding, such as the Government of Canada established the permanent department with the MMIW Secretariat with funding to support the work. And most importantly, the National Families and Survivors Circle continues to be at the core of all of this work. Next slide. So this is the urban sub-working group. So we were a component of that larger plan. And so our urban sub-working group had 11 members from across Canada, representing First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. We were all families and survivors. We met weekly for that whole year from July 2020 to June 2021, when we shared our national action plan. And our mandate was to develop an urban framework for the national action plan. And we'd like to also acknowledge the members who participated with us at that stage to develop the national action plan. And that's Patuiti, Inuit Women of Canada, Native Women's Association of Canada, and Le Femme Michif. All were involved in the development of our national action plan. Inspired and guided by the MMIWG2S Plus National Inquiry final report, our source document is the National Inquiry Report, which did a good job outlining what needs to be put into action. So none of it really was a surprise, you know, to many of us who have been working on the front lines for many, many years, identifying what those gaps is. So we didn't feel we needed to do any more research to fill any significant gaps, except for, of course, the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ and the uniqueness of the urban realities. And so that's where we had concentrated our efforts on the urban realities, and certainly how that impacts our Two-Spirit LGBTQIA relatives. So nothing about us without us, and reclaiming power in place was a really important part of our work. And inspired by the National Inquiry's use of sacred ceremonial items, the teachings of the baskets and the blanket guided our work. So our approach, we saw our role and the way we looked at developing the National Action Plan was this is a forever document, with the first 5-year priorities with timelines that identified short, within 2 years, medium, 3 to 5 years, and then long-term, over 5 years. And we wanted to call out and acknowledge and work from the work of genocide, the outcome of genocide, and the impact of genocide for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited LGBTQIA, stopping it, preventing it, and supporting healing those who have experienced it. We also, there is an urgency to our work, a fundamental realignment of transformation of systems in society as they currently exist. We just cannot accept the status quo anymore. The transformative change is necessary in order to move forward, in order to really have long-term sustainable impact. We focused on rights and responsibilities. Defining urban and co-development was also a really important part of our work, and you're going to hear more about that from our other speakers. And then there were the 8 pathways, the urban approach to end violence. And if I could draw your attention to the next slide. These are the urban pathway to end violence. And I recognize that there's lots of information on this slide. And I'm just going to highlight a few things that are really critically important. If you look at the urban pathways to end violence and you look at them as a whole document, you'll see that there really is a big shift of what our advocacy focuses in on. And that is having urban Indigenous organizations supporting urban Indigenous people, and that where urban Indigenous organizations do not exist, then we need to help them exist in order to be able to deliver services. We know that the answers have always been at the kitchen tables and in urban centers, and we are strong advocates to start having significant investments being made into urban Indigenous organizations. And then supporting all of the systems and the infrastructure around that, not only to ensure that that happens, but also to ensure that there is long-term sustainable action that is happening as it relates to services in the urban area. We talk about establishing a national urban First Nation, Inuit, Métis strategy. Because we recognize that there is a unique way, unique vulnerabilities, but also unique strengths when it comes to urban centers, regardless of where you are in the country. That we recognize and support urban First Nation, Inuit, and Métis expertise, and provide that long-term sustainable funding and capacity where it's needed. To have clear roles and responsibilities, to strengthen the mutual accountability that happens within urban centers. Establishing an oversight and mechanism monitoring system is also going to ensure that we are making sure that those systems are accountable to the impacts and what we're all working towards achieving. And co-development was a really important part, and you're going to hear more about that very shortly. Co-development really being a key part of our work, really recognizing that there is a common table, that it's not just one system, one government, one organization, one women's group, one of anything, that is its sole responsibility is to work on this issue. This really needs to take a intersectional approach, needs to have multiple people sitting at the table working towards the same goal. And so co-development leading to co-management is we have tons of experience, certainly as urban Indigenous organizations, on when that works really well. And so we have lots of opportunity to build on those wise practices across the country. Culture-based community development, where services are delivered by urban Indigenous organizations for urban Indigenous people. Access to urban land-based activities within our cities and towns, ensuring that that is really an important part of the healing that needs to happen, and the accessibility to those are going to be critical. Prevention-based approaches and intergovernmental and intergovernmental coordination and collaboration with urban Indigenous-led organizations is also going to be really critical in the work moving forward. And so these 8 pathways to end violence makes up the National Action Plan, the Urban National Action Plan. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Gertie May Muse. And she is a member of the Newfoundland Aboriginal Women's Network and is now the current CEO of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. And for the next 15 minutes, she's going to be sharing with you the highlights of our work. And I'll pass it over to you now, Gertie May.
Thank you, Diane. Hi, everyone. Walalan, thank you for joining us today. I've been asked to share the work that we did in defining urban and also co-development and intersectionality. And so we thought the agreeing on an urban definition was critical to our work, just because of the rates of Indigenous identity politics that were impacting on our ability to be clear about who we are and what we're about. The urbanization of Indigenous people in Canada does not mean assimilation. Far from it. The cultures of urban Indigenous communities across the country are strong and resilient. The data that we do have tells us that the majority of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people live in and around urban centers and towns. Urban Indigenous peoples have created our own institutions, programs, services, kin networks, communities, and cultures that are separate and decoupled, often decoupled from Indigenous tribal homelands, off-reserve or off-settlement lands. There are over 6,000 urban Indigenous service delivery organizations across the country that have many strengths. Many of these organizations are led by Indigenous women. Urban communities need to be recognized, respected, valued, and be at decision-making tables where decisions impacting our lives are made. To ignore or devalue urban is to ignore and devalue Indigenous women. Another key strength of urban Indigenous communities is that they are highly inclusive, and that includes two-spirited LGBTQIA peoples. As a working group, we knew it was very important to agree upon a definition, for too long the dominant culture and colonial discourse defined us. The group agreed that there were critical interconnecting elements when we were defining urban, which include demographic evolution and the push and pulls towards urban life, the complex identities and the reclaiming of our whole selves, geographic inclusion, meaning wherever we reside, the portability of rights, and the full exercising and enjoyment of those human and Indigenous rights. Lastly, the impact of jurisdictional wrangling that often excludes and denies urban Indigenous people of rights. We landed on this definition. First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples living in small, medium, and large communities, including rural, isolated, and remote communities, which are off reserve, outside of their home community, community of origin or settlement, or outside of Inuit Nunavut. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so I apologize if that's a mispronunciation. We are calling upon all levels of government, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis government and organizations to accept, respect, and apply this definition going forward. To fail to do so will continue the legacy of violence and erasure of urban Indigenous communities. So we spent a lot of time on that. And it was quite an experience. It was an honor and a privilege to be with the women as we sourced that definition and really unpacked what it means to be urban Indigenous. We also talked about co-development as a solution to addressing the national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited LGBTQIA. Because of its size and scope that requires everyone to participate if we are to enable the deep systemic transformation that's called for in the inquiry. So co-development in this manner is about a shared responsibility and accountability between all levels of government, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis government and urban Indigenous communities. Co-development ensures that Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit LGBTQIA, survivors and families are at tables from the onset and have a respected place in our collective solution making. Urban Indigenous people and two-spirited LGBTQIA people are often left out of current federal decision making and funding models, in which case co-development is seen here as a practical means to address this gap without further jurisdictional wrangling or debate. Co-development helps us to level the playing field so that everyone's voices are valued, respected, and allowed to contribute meaningfully to ending violence. Additionally, successful co-development and co-management processes moves us ever forward towards determination. Successful co-development processes have critical interconnected elements that include a focus on rights and responsibilities. So we are decolonizing and reconciling as we go, an intersectoral approach across all levels of government and ministries, involves equity and equality and respect, particularly in decision-making and resourcing, have identified, shared, and agreed upon vision, goals, and objectives, have clear and agreed upon decision-making and conflict resolution mechanisms during the process, have a clear understanding and agreement about the respective roles and responsibilities of all parties, have high quality accountability mechanisms that are measurable and transparent. And finally, co-development has clear expectations for the process and the outcomes or the impacts intended. Co-development is important to create the NAP and its associated implementation plan, but the processes may include co-management, which have similar elements to co-development, but co-management speaks to a longer term and more sustainable process over time. The other term that we wanted to define as a part of our report and almost like a principle is the intersectionality. We wanted to recognize that intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, sex, and ableism as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. And through an awareness of intersectionality, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us. So these were some of the core framing of a lot of our definitions that we were wanting to bring about across our entire report. So Diane, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gertie May. So our next speaker and our next slide is Jocelyn who is the Executive Director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. And for the next 15 minutes, she will be presenting on the components of our implementation plan.
I will do my best to keep it to for those 15 minutes because we've got very ambitious implementation plans here. So, Wache Misawe, Shwe Banish, Nishnakasun, Muskrini Tlistin. So my community is Muskree First Nation along the James Bay, Ontario side in Northern Ontario. But I've lived and worked in Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, more or less around the last 12 or 15 years. And thank you all for being here with us. I think it's a pretty good turnout with a very diverse group of folks listening. So you heard about our background and some of the definitions and unpacking what that means. With the implementation, I think we envision this as the how, right? As you can imagine, there's been thousands now of pages of documents of the what and the why. And we really needed to provide some direction to the folks that we were working with and hoping to partner with on implementing these calls to justice on how. So we had a really wonderful writer, Leah Mackenzie Nicholas, who reviewed the inquiry report itself, all of the action plans, including the urban subworking group action plan. And we've narrowed it down to 3 implementation themes, which are the urban reality, so ensuring the urban voice and place in solutions, responsibilities and accountabilities. So that's identifying and accepting our responsibility to end violence through measured goals and monitoring impacts while ensuring accountability for all governments, and co-development, coordination, and collaboration. This emphasizes nothing about us without us and builds on the fact that we are stronger when we work together. One of the challenging things has been, within an urban environment, while we are inclusive, there's also a shared experience with urban-based people. We wanted to make it clear that there's a vital, innovative, resilient, and strong urban Indigenous presence in Canada. In nearly every urban environment that we live and work and play and call our homes, that we're not just visiting, that we are part of that urban reality. And you look across the country and there are many communities where we're 3, 4, 5 generations in that we are part of that urban landscape. But also recognizing there are many of our people that are very mobile and come and go. There's an increasing demographic, economic, and cultural importance of urban communities that need to be recognized and celebrated. For decades, we have used our experience and creativity to shift from barely managing poverty to being successful, strength, and value-based services rooted in relationships. However, we haven't been able to provide, or we haven't been provided with the adequate resources to ensure that we can properly support and provide services to the community members that are asking these things of us. Further, as most urban service delivery organizations are led and accessed by women, ignoring urban is also about ignoring urban Indigenous women. Our vision is ending violence will require fundamental transformation of systems and society. Our vision is to restore the rightful place of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+ people within a dramatically changed country. Our bold and strength-based vision has a focus on claiming our space, addressing violence, and ensuring a bright future. We've developed an urban definition, which you heard from my colleague Gertie May. We want to see inclusive terminology because we know that our identities are complex, and it's getting easier by the day. We also want to ensure that any work that is done regarding Indigenous peoples is done with a view of regardless of residency, recognizing that if we are going to be actually addressing violence, that we need to do it in a way that recognizes where our people are. We need to ensure the application of human rights, regardless of residency, and increase engagement by survivors, families, and urban Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ people. So that's the urban reality. First, recognizing there is an urban reality, and then adjusting our policies, approaches, and funding to account for that reality. Secondly, responsibilities and accountabilities. We're calling for the restoration of our roles and responsibilities and the full enjoyment of all of our human rights as urban Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ people. We are also mindful of our responsibilities to each other, to the earth, and to our cultures. Accountability is critically important and must include measurable goals, the monitoring of impacts, as well as accountability for all governments, federal, provincial, Indigenous, who fail to protect us and support our goal of a better life. So under this, we're looking at distinctions-based as defined by the National Inquiry Final Report. And I'm going to review what exactly that said in the report about distinction-based. Services and solutions must be led by Indigenous governments, organizations, and people. This is based on self-determination and self-governance of Indigenous peoples as defined by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Further, the exclusion of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA people, elders, and children from the exercise of self-determination must end. In recognizing distinctions, Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA people are from diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. The calls to justice must be interpreted and implemented in an equitable and non-discriminatory way, addressing the needs of distinct Indigenous peoples and taking into account factors that make them distinct. These include, but are not limited to, self-identification, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, geographical or regional specific information, north, south, east, west, proximity to urban centers, oceans, water, and natural resources, locations of traditional territories and homelands, municipal, provincial, and territorial boundaries, as well as residency, on reserve / off reserve, rural / urban, remote, and northern communities and settlements. A gendered lens and framework that ensures impacts on women, girls, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA individuals are taken into account. This includes understanding the differences and diversity amongst Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA people, and understanding that the needs within communities of individuals may not necessarily be the same. This was very wise thinking and inclusion for the MMIWG inquiry report. And we appreciate that it gave us a basis for which we can launch and really help fill out that definition of what we saw was distinctions-based. We need to recognize that jurisdictional wrangling is a reality of the urban experience. And we need to work with all governments and include urban Indigenous perspectives on building best practices and creating accountability processes so that we don't have more people fall through the gaps. Dialogue and accountability. First Nations, Métis, Inuit governments and organizations need to understand the impact of the distinctions-based approach on urban Indigenous women and US LGBTQIA+ people, and they should be pushing for urban causes. This work is closely tied to the clarification of organizational mandates and governance standards for local, regional, provincial, territorial, and national bodies as part of an Indigenous-led accountability project. When we're talking about things like legislation, policy development, funding decisions, program determinations, we need to ensure that there is a recognition of the urban experience and that's built into those structures as well. And that in anything that we're developing, we need to establish anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-transgender violence prevention programs. And we have a number of other areas we want to see: development of ongoing training, development of existing tools, codes of conduct, and as well as ongoing training for government funders. We're calling for an oversight oversight mechanism and monitoring bodies to ensure that we actually can see through these actions and implementation in a wholesome way. As well as funding criteria and accountability to the need to define and revisit criteria for Indigenous service providers as Indigenous led through governing bodies, senior management, and frontline staff. Non-Indigenous groups should not have access to Indigenous specific resources if they're not led by Indigenous peoples. An accountability mechanism is needed for all stages in the funding relationship, and we must ensure that funding is clearly advertised as Indigenous specific. If we don't have those existing models, we need to create new models. The third area is around co-development, coordination, and collaboration. So under this, we're calling for respect for and full inclusion of dynamic, resilient, and strong urban Indigenous communities and voices would lead to human rights advancement, culturally appropriate programs and services, and significantly improve socioeconomic conditions. We must take a new approach to eradicate violence, a co-development approach. And urban Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ people must contribute as equal partners at the table. We've developed a list of critical and interconnected elements for co-development that can be found in the urban path. But we want to see an urban strategy developed that recognizes and supports urban Indigenous expertise and substantive urban program renewal. That there should be a series of federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous meetings with representatives to develop strategic approach that are inclusive of urban. Sustainable long-term funding should be a core principle, and request that policy commitment statements from all governments regarding collaboration, co-development, commitment of time and other resources, and into new approaches implying emerging wise practices. We feel as though there's a lot that urban Indigenous organizations can offer, a lot of expertise in coordination and partnership development within the urban settings. And we'd like the opportunity to participate fully in developing and implementing those solutions as we have been working in these fields, at least within friendship centers, at least for the last 70 years. And so we don't think that new things need to be developed, and we don't want to see whatever's developed inadvertently causing more barriers to our people than have already been developed. So I think that's it for the overview on the implementation themes, and I'll hand it back to Diane to round us off.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And so our next speaker is Amanda Killebuck from, she's the executive director of TI, and honestly, she will have to say her organization's name. I didn't practice enough before this meeting today, and my apologies. This is an urban Inuit organization, and she's going to be sharing with you some of our future plans. So over to you, Amanda.
Matna Diane, ulukut Amanda Kalabayunga, Tukamwati Yunga, Tukuzivungat Inuit Kuni. Good day, everyone. My name is Amanda Kalabak, and I'm the executive director of Tumusvingat Inuit, located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And I'm originally from Akvet and Iqaluit, Nunavut. I have been part of the urban sub-working group since July 2020 and was part of creating the MMIWG2S plus Urban National Action Plan and our current implementation plan, which you have heard from Diane, Gertie-May, and Jocelyn. I have the pleasure of sharing with you some of our future plans moving forward. And as you can see on the slide, we highlight 4 key areas: amplifying urban voices, promoting co-development, national virtual conferences, and urban Indigenous service organizations engagement. We also see and hope to add to these 4 areas as we increase our engagement with urban Indigenous-led organizations this year. We all feel very strongly that amplifying the voice of urban Indigenous people is critical to our success to end violence of our urban Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples in our urban spaces. We know the answers are within our urban Indigenous-led organizations and at the grassroots where our women, families, and knowledge keepers are. We also know that our answers, the real solutions to ending violence in our urban spaces, have always been there. And we believe that this is our opportunity to bring those strong urban Indigenous voices forward to be heard in a big way, to be valued in a big way, and supported with long-term sustainable funding to do the work. As you have heard, urban Indigenous organizations are often led by women and have accomplished a great deal to advance the human rights of Indigenous people in Canada. A quote from our national plan is fitting to highlight. From Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond, an Aboriginal law expert and human rights scholar, noted that urban communities and organizations have played a very important role when it comes to protecting and promoting human rights. The history of colonialism and the lack of access to justice have resulted in an adversarial pathway for women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ to assert human rights. That path is usually only taken when urban communities and organizations wrap us with support to assert our collective or individual rights. The Urban Working Group plan moving forward is to ensure there is real and meaningful investment in our solutions to end violence. We will do this by 1, amplifying our urban voice. We sent our urban path to reclaiming power and place, regardless of residency, national action plan to all the mayors of major cities in each province, to the premiers of each province and territory, to key ministers and bureaucrats in the federal government, and a copy to each of our First Nation, Inuit, Métis governments, along with several major universities in Canada that work on violence prevention initiatives. We are doing this presentation everywhere we can, at provincial and territorial tables, with several federal departments, at local, regional, and national gatherings, and we hope to do more within cities and grassroots groups. 2, we're promoting co-development. This is a foundational part of our work. Nothing about us without us. We know we can't just hope for the best, that people and systems will come together to co-develop, co-create, and co-manage. We will put together some helpful guidelines and processes based on some successful initiatives to help support this vital way to get the work done. 3, the national virtual conferences. This is the first national virtual information session, and we are planning on working on several national virtual conferences and perhaps an in-person urban Indigenous conference in the fall winters, so we can dive deeper and have meaningful discussions on issues facing urban Indigenous organizations, set concrete actions in certain areas so we can collectively advocate for more resources for urban Indigenous organizations to do the work. And what is really important, to learn from each other, network, and share our wise, promising practices. We also hope to increase our own opportunities to coordinate, collaborate, and seek ways to have the greatest impact. And lastly, urban Indigenous service organizations engagement. Our initial estimates are that there are over 6,000 urban Indigenous organizations in Canada. We see this as incredible knowledge, skills, and voices on issues facing our urban relatives, and we can't wait to seek more ways to build this powerful network. Today, we hope that this is the first of many sessions we can have together, and we begin with our email address that will be on the next slide. Please send us an email so we can stay in touch and ensure you are aware of information, funding opportunities, and other ways to be involved. We plan for this to be evolved in a united voice and enhance the urban response to the 231 calls for justice, urban national action plan, and implementation plan. But now for your time today, we really believe as urban Indigenous-led organizations that together we are powerful. Matna.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for our inspiring work moving forward. Thank you so much. And so our last slide is next, and our last presenter is for our closing remarks. This is Sylvia Miracle, our matriarch, our knowledge keeper, strong advocate for 2S LGBTQIA, also strong advocate for urban Indigenous people. As we know, many of you have crossed her path. She's retired executive director from the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. And so I'd now like to pass it over to Sylvia for her closing remarks and to kind of wrap this up and a nice package for everyone. And just to remind people, please feel free if you have any questions to use the Q&A. And I believe we might be able to do the hand thing, but I will ask our helpers from NAFC to assist with that part. So I'll turn it over to Sylvia now.
All right. I usually am on mute when I say the smartest things, so I'm off now. We'll see how I do. So the easy part for me with this slide, as you can tell, is I was told to just repackage everything that my sisters and my friends and colleagues and have been unpacking for you about moving forward. In 1978, as a very young person in the Friendship Center movement, I was part of writing a report called Strangers in Our Own Land. And in Strangers in Our Own Land, we were talking already about the urban experience. 30% of us lived out of our home communities then. Today, the national average is 60. In the province where I've lived and worked, and my home community is, it's almost 85%. So we're not a minority. The other thing that I remind people is we've always lived in these spaces. I remember reading a book as a young person by Chief John Snow, who was talking about the ceremonial in the foothills and the mountains. And he said, you know, these places are our sacred spaces. Why wouldn't we have lived in the best places before anybody got here? So this whole notion of urban as a construct outside of us isn't true. At one time, you know, there were 30,000 Senecas living on one side of the river here in Toronto, and you know, equally, if not exactly equal, of Mississaugas and Huron-Wendat people living on the other. We always lived here, so I always find it a unique situation that somehow we're displaced. I mean, we are displaced people, but somehow it's not recognized that we were always here too. That, you know, at the Forks in Manitoba, we were always there. In downtown Vancouver, and at Big Inlet, we were always there. Along the shores of Montreal, we were there. In the bays in the east, we were always there. And we're talking about a notion that people have placed upon us that urban is somehow not correct. And I would argue that the whole notion of the inquiry report of returning to power in place is an interesting concept. I wish it had said, you know, that we were going to confirm power in place, that it wasn't just recognizing something. We keep doing the same thing the same way, right? The definition of insanity. And we back when Amnesty International was first looking at the phenomena of missing and murdered women, and you know, that's almost 2 decades ago. It took a long time. It took a lot of Indigenous women who lit the fire. and a lot of Indigenous women and some supporters and allies who got the issue to the front, who pressed for a national inquiry. It took a UN rapporteur on women's violence in the world. It took demonstration after demonstration. It took the creation of imagery, the red dress. It took round dances in the corners of main streets in large cities. And finally, we arrived. And the inquiry did a tremendous job of documenting the situation. They actually didn't tell us anything we didn't know. They didn't say to us, there's a whole missing piece of history. There isn't. And it seems to me that that I appreciate, one of the things I appreciate this walk is that we, for a year and a half, we probably started out crying together. And then, because we're Indigenous women, the more heavier our emotional load gets, the more we laugh. So we laugh together. We then swore together and railed at the system for a while, and then we prayed together. And now we're here. And it seems to me that Indigenous led organizations have been talked about as amazing community development phenomena of people who are concerned about an issue coming together. And yet the government and often private sector continue to treat us the same way. And those groups have to change. There are non-Indigenous groups who do tremendous work, but they can't replace us. They have to make space, and it's not just making space. It's about passing on resources and to say that it is our responsibility to care for our community, to redevelop our community, to braid it back together, to put things back in our baskets and our bundles that are ours. And the government has to quit saying, well, we're just going along with what the leadership says. Well, maybe then they should be talking to the other leaders. Maybe they should be talking to the people who are doing a lot of the work. And the history, right, of us being around since the 1950s. And the work, the spectrum of work that's done without supportive policy, without legislation, without provinces and territories being engaged with very few municipalities, isn't tipping it. It is our hurt, our pain, our loss. That's a driver, an economic driver for so many other groups in this society. And they don't want to have a struggle. They want to keep going along, and they want to keep getting resources and accolades for what they do. And if they were true allies, they would step back and create the space for leadership to come forward. And the words that we have about inclusive and intersectionality, really, we have to begin as well to look at ourselves. It's not a one-way process, this. It's a process where we have to undertake better social planning functions. That we have to look at mission drift that's happened in our own organizations because we chase money. We have to go back to our own grassroots and build up a membership because we want to ask them, what do they want and how can we be directed? We just don't want to put a Band-Aid on it and say, this is the issue now, and we did a good job and we opened a few things. We want to create fundamental change in relationships in our community, amongst ourselves, in a supportive policy way, in a legislation way, and in a resource way. And then we will have reclaimed power in place. But it won't just be Indigenous women, because Indigenous women don't just worry about themselves. They worry about for generations to come, the young ones who are here now, the elderly who need our support, the people who have alter abilities in our community. I found great comfort working with the urban group, speaking about the dispossession of the two-spirited, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning queer, intersex, asex, plus people. But I also found an honest approach saying, we didn't know what to do. We don't know who to talk to. We weren't sure. And I think if everybody approached the question like that about what can we do? What kind of power can we have? How can we change? We will return to power in place. Daneto.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. You can keep that slide on, our tech people. I just want to make sure people have access to our email address. I think that's Bridget. Thank you very much. And so thank you to all of the presenters, and please keep in mind, everyone, we are a few members of a larger group, and the rest of our team members, which are with our fantastic writer Leah, are also online here, and their bios and who they are on the information that was sent to you, and you certainly can send us an email. We'd be happy to forward you the full name of everyone on the urban working group. And so again, to the rest of the members, we acknowledge you. We often refer to our group as, these are really the Indigenous women who are considered the worker bees, always behind the scenes, making stuff happen, lifting a heavy load to get things off the ground, and to do a lot of the work that needs to be done, because it just has to get done and somebody's got to do it. And so we operate very similar in that fashion as we would with many of our sister urban Indigenous organizations that are joining us here today. And so we're all in good company. So I'm going to move to, there are a couple of questions. One of them is an easy one to answer about the recording. We are recording this session, and we will, you can send us an email and ask for the recording. And I believe that we will advertise this as well in places, because we really do want to get this information out there to the universe, certainly to our sister urban Indigenous organizations, to make sure that you are aware, as well as to governments, because that's a really key piece, and that is certainly the areas that we want to target and concentrate on, particularly as it relates to the funding that many of our members have been talking about here. So yes, the recording will be available through email and many other ways. Then there was a question regarding in the Q&A about if someone might tell us the role you see for municipal governments in this plan. So to answer first, that we'll have two members answer this question. So we'll start with Amanda, and then we will ask Gertie May to comment secondly, and then I'll go and see if there's other questions in the meantime.
Matna Elaine for the question. And so I think TI is uniquely positioned because we are an active member with the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition. And in this membership and through their advocacy work, they work very closely with the City of Ottawa. And there's a lot of working groups that we participate on, like the Indigenous Women's Safety Table, Community Safety and Wellbeing, or we advocate in the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. So from those, the Indigenous Women's Safety Table, there are other working groups that TI or OAC has participation and representation, and that's the Policing Working Group, Mental Health and Addictions, Housing and Homelessness, and the group home system. So through, and I think what we didn't necessarily say during this time is that, you know, urban Indigenous voices is needed around the table. We need a seat at the table, and having a seat on the table allows our voices to be heard. And I feel that in Ottawa's case, at least through the strong OAC, that we're able to really highlight our needs. And so for the latest community safety and well-being plan, there is projects and services or funding specifically for Indigenous mental health. And so this is just a small example of kind of that relationship with different municipalities. I can't speak for any of the other municipalities, whether they're large urban or in rural, but I just wanted to share TI's experience. Taima.
Thank you. We'll go to Gertie May, and then Jocelyn has a few words for this question as well.
Well, I would just like to say that, you know, we live in cities and towns, and I think municipalities have a critical role to play in helping address violence. And a lot of it has to do with working directly with Indigenous governed service providers to learn about their plans and to be supporting those plans, and amplifying the voices of those organizations in those communities, so that you're an active ally participating in change, in using your networks across government, and also with even in the corporate world, and then also your relationships with the provinces, to really hold everyone accountable for supporting our communities while we work together collectively to transform the systems that continue to create these cycles of violence. The other thing I would say about municipalities is that you know, you need to have more openness towards having Indigenous organizations come to your council tables to find other ways of bringing that legitimate voice when decisions that are impacting on our communities are being made at the council level. I really think municipalities play a critical role in all of this work. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and then we'll move on to another question.
I appreciate the question, and I think we've put a lot of time and effort into the language that we're using, and have been quite deliberate. And so when we say all levels of government, we're also inclusive of the municipal governments, recognizing that everybody has a role to play. And, you know, I think if we're looking back at a different report, which was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, one of the brilliant things that I think those commissioners did was they didn't just hand the report to government and said, here you go, this is your report, implement it. But they actually gave the report to all of us across the country, and every sector was implicated in what we need to do on truth and reconciliation. And I feel like in that same vein, we're doing the same with this report, right? With the MMIWG2S LGBTQIA+ report and action plan, is that this isn't from Indigenous people to the federal government, and this isn't the federal government putting something on Indigenous peoples. We've broadcast what we view as our vision and what we think needs to be done, and we've said how we want it to be done, and that's inclusive of everybody who has a role. And so if you're reading this report and you're a leader, whether you're an Indigenous government, whether you're a municipality, province, federal government, whatever department, if you see yourself in this work, then you have a responsibility to do something about it. And if you're wondering how, that's why we've developed the how. You know, find who those organizations are that are doing that work in your community. They probably already know each other, and they've probably already talked to you at some point, or somebody within your government. And so assume that the work is already happening, and then see how you can fit yourself into that work. and come to the table offering some really concrete things. I can do this, I can help facilitate this. And it doesn't always have to be about funding. It can be about ensuring that other resources are available, whether that's organizing, space, all of those things help when you're actually talking about the work on the ground.
Excellent. Thank you, Jocelyn. So just to reiterate or answer some questions again. So yes, the recording will be available. So there's the email address on there. You can send us an email. And I understand it will also be available on some of the Facebook pages on any one of our organizations here. I don't know how to do that, but I'm sure there's really smart people that can help get that done. And the PowerPoint, please send us an email. Happy to get that to you, our PowerPoint presentation as well. So I understand that there is a question that is somebody had raised their hand and would like to ask a question. I could have lost track of all of this stuff in the chat room. So could I ask the person who is that Natalie raised her hand?
Yeah, Natalie Fortin had raised her hand, and then there's another anonymous question in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. This I don't know. I didn't raise my hand. Sorry.
Yeah, you're like me.
Yeah, I just.
That looks
probably...
like a button. That looks like a fun button.
Okay, and there's an anonymous question in the chat. I'm not really
okay.
Sure if it's...
Okay. Okay, spoke about accountability. Do all individuals who use the banner MMIW contact your organization about funds collected or raised? I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Any other members wish to comment on this?
I would just like to, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I just want to say that we are definitely not a funding organization. Our working group is not a funder. If that's what's being asked, I'm not sure, but Sil has her hand raised.
Okay, we'll go to Sylvia, and then and then Jocelyn.
So we're a committee tasked with trying to come up with an action plan, a piece of an action plan. But I am aware that there are groups who do raise money. They haven't asked anybody if they should raise money. There isn't any accountability about the money, so nobody often knows what they raise or where it goes to. So it is this is the kind of thing where I'm talking about, you have to have a link with the urban Indigenous community, and there has the reciprocity doesn't mean it, you can just create your own GoFund and do whatever. Not all groups who are raising money appear to be Indigenous groups, so it's a pretty fraught with difficulty issues, and I think one should always be careful. And I much prefer an approach that's documented, where we have an agreement and we agree that something's going to be done and occur, and there's a report back. So so because, as my friends have said, it's not explicit. I think, though, the answer to your question is not every group who's raising money for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls includes 2S LGBTQIA+, or actually has permission, authority to do something about it. And so be careful.
Thank you, Sylvia. Jocelyn?
I think with a question like this, we also get the opportunity to project our own points onto the question. This is, I think it's a big question, and when I'm reading into this, I'm picking up the accountability piece. and people who are operating, maybe working or raising funds under the banner of MMIWG. We certainly see a lot of people who maybe aren't doing the work, who use the banner or you know, reference it and fundraise. And what I would just say is, you know, if you're partnering, if you're working in this space, or looking to get into it, you could use, there's some guidelines that you could use to make sure that you're engaging with an organization that is truly by and for Indigenous people. And you look at who the decision makers are within those organizations. If those organizations, decision makers are not Indigenous women and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA folks, that should be a flag to you about what's happening with that work and who it's directed by and who it's accountable to. Follow the money and where the funding is going to, and whether the funding is actually going to assisting people or you know, where a large amount of the funds are going. I think that's another indicator. And I'm not saying there's a correct answer to that. I'm saying that those are indicators or things that you can ask that might help you understand who you're going to be working with. Because certainly when you're going to get into this space, especially if there's money on the table, you may see folks who might be stepping up into the space. And I think what we are talking about, going back to our implementation, especially around the accountability piece, is that we want to make sure that the work is accountable to the people who started this movement. As Sylvia said, this wasn't started by a government initiative. It wasn't started by not-for-profits. It was started by people who were experiencing this firsthand and seeing what was happening in their communities and spoke up about it. And that's really who we should be accountable to in the end. And they're the ones who are determining whether or not we're doing a good enough job.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, Sylvia, for that, and Gertie May. And I understand that there were also some, there was another question in there about, was something I think I could answer. I'd have to apologize. I'm not used to doing two things at the same time. Okay, so again, if your question is not answered, please feel free to email us with your question. And again, our report, the recording and the PowerPoint, all of that definitely will be available. And and we will actually put just now our national action plan is put into the chat to make it easier for you, so you can download and read that report. And so again, and I just want to reiterate what was said already around certainly the funding pieces and where we are as a working group on ensuring that its urban Indigenous organizations are receiving the funding to do the work, and when they don't exist, that they are supported to exist. And these are conversations that our group, the urban working group, is really been trying and being and it's helpful to get lots of support to be able to sit at those tables and to express our views on the funding pieces, because the funding oftentimes is what you need in order to do the work. And those solutions, as Amanda was talking about, have been at our kitchen tables and with our knowledge keepers forever. And we know that. And so the opportunity has never been there in this way, to this degree, to be able to start funding those initiatives that we know work, we know will have positive and meaningful and sustainable impact to creating safety and ending violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA. And we have just, recently have met with ministers, whether it be certainly in the federal government. We have outreached as well to the provincial and territorial tables to say all of those same things, is that we have to fund the solutions at the grassroots level, and that this is co-development is a way to get there. We are not saying there's only one way to do co-development and co-management. It is really about that, creating that common table and that one goal of everybody working together. And so how that materializes and gets realized across a whole bunch of territories is going to be different, and that's great, because that is really how many things get started and achieved and are successful within our urban territories, because there's always that one organization or those women's groups or those grassroots initiatives are the worker bees that often just do it because it has to get done. And we want to be able to elevate those voices and showcase and honor those wise practices that have been running and doing things oftentimes without even government funding. And so those are the initiatives that we really want to invest in, and we know that that is certainly the way forward. So I'm just going to check in one last time to see if there have been any questions. So this one here is, have you been asked to sit on advisory for any police service yet? And I can open it up to our members.
With specific, yeah, this is Amanda. Not specifically for police boards, but we do participate in working groups with a lot of City of Ottawa police members that attend. Emma.
Thank you. Any other members?
I just wanted to add that we are looking at training for police officers around Indigenous specific racism and the violence against Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit LGBTQIA. So there is work happening. Probably not fast enough, but there is work happening.
Thank you, Gertie May. Sylvia?
The RCMP came to the 2S committee. I thought they came to the urban committee as well. And they invited us to review their draft training materials, both for individual police officers responding and the systems in terms of being able to address families. So they are not far along in their project, but they are trying to upgrade what they have as a result of the inquiry's report.
Thank you, Sylvia. And yeah, that's a really important piece. I think individually as members, we all have various levels of engagement with law enforcement and policing agencies across Canada. Some have been good experiences and some haven't been so great experiences as well, where we have in one way or another sat at various seats and tables. And so, and I think that will be an ongoing, a really ongoing conversation and an ongoing partnership that is essential, particularly in this work. And so I really hope that we can at some point start showcasing some of those wise practices and highlight those areas of where some initiatives are going really well, and that we can learn from them and hopefully replicate more and more of those relationships as they evolve. And there is one more question in the chat.
Yeah.
And that is, how do you envision the overseeing body? And who would like to answer that from our group?
Good question.
Go ahead, Gertie May.
I can start. So when we're talking about an oversight body, we're talking about urban Indigenous organizations from coast to coast to coast who are actively engaged in doing this work and have history in doing this work. We're talking about measuring impact. We're talking about, re-establishing data processes and pathways that are meaningful, that is more accurately reflecting the realities of the experience of women and girls and two-spirit LGBTQIA peoples in our communities. And we're also talking about accountability from all levels of government, as we discussed. So those are some of the principles, I guess, that we've discussed to now. I don't know if any other group member would like to. Maggie Paul, I love it. Hi, Maggie Paul. So yeah, so I think that there's a lot of discussion around the parameters, and I'm not sure if anybody else has other things they'd like to add.
Sure. Sylvia.
Part of the National Action Plan requires a public report on the implementation process progress of various components. We tabled the National Action Plan on June 3rd last year, and I believe on June 3rd this year, we are expected to report on the progress we've made, and if we've had challenges, what are they? And those are meant to be public, I understand.
Yes, and all of the other working groups as that was identified in that created other national action plans, they are also continuing their work. And so there are, and I would assume that at some point there'll be some consolidation of sort of where everybody is at. Sylvia said June 3rd will be, an important milestone to know what everybody else is, where they are in those national action plans, including the urban group, and as well as the two-spirit LGBTQIA that Sylvia is chairing, which is another sub-working group. So we'll take another question, and then, was that the last question? Oh no, so there was another question. Catherine has raised her hand. So Catherine, would you like to ask your question? And let us know who you would like to answer it. Or Catherine, did you like the raise hand button and pushed it?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. I just want to say Chimigwech Kukshem to all the presenters. And I had to look over at the documents, and I just have to say it's been a huge undertaking, and I'm very pleased to see that there's a commitment on all fronts to end violence. I'm calling from Toronto, and I'm just wondering, as a community member within the urban setting here, how can I be involved to provide input and solutions in regards to MMIWG2, and particularly what is really dear to my heart is ending the Millennium Scoop genocide of the overrepresentation of our children in the child welfare system. And what I've been seeing is that life givers aren't really given the opportunity to provide their voices in the Ontario child welfare redesign. So I guess my question goes to Sylvia Miracle in regards to how community members within the urban settings can voice what's going on here in Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
there's a major social plan taking place in Toronto, spelled, of course, its traditional way, Toronto. And it's just about to be published. I mean, I think it is published. It's about to be distributed to the community. It talks about a variety of areas, including the degree of violence, and it does talk about child welfare. There are groups like the Toronto Aboriginal Social Services Council, who's produced this social planning tool with the City of Toronto and a number of community foundations. There's also Native Child and Family Services. They're always looking for engagement, both in their governance process and their consultative processes. There's a two-spirited organization called Two-Spirited People of the First Nations here in the city. So there's quite a, there's you know, there are like 40 some agencies now in the city of Toronto. So there are women's shelters, there are transition housing, there are any number of ways if you want to get involved. I don't mean to pass it off, but probably if you visit the Toronto Aboriginal Social Service Council, you'll find some of the information you're looking for, and maybe some groups where you can get directly engaged and have conversations.
Thank you, Sylvia, and great question, Catherine, and great questions from everybody. Thank you so much for all of your questions and for everybody being here today. I'm going to wrap this up. We still have the email address on the screen here, and really encouraging all of you to reach out to us. This is a way you can get your email address on a list. So when we come across funding opportunities that we know is going to be related to urban Indigenous organizations, we will send that to you. We will continue to let you know when there are other opportunities, because there's so much content and unpacking we did today that we'd like to continue on and have deeper dives when we have an opportunity to come together again virtually, and then as well, hopefully in person sometime in the next fiscal year, and of course when it's safe to do so. And so there, we really want to expand our reach and our work into the organizations that are really doing the heavy lifting, because we're hoping that the work that we do is going to amplify our urban Indigenous voices, maximize the resources and the investments that are made into urban Indigenous organizations, because we wholeheartedly believe that's where the answers are, and that's where the leadership needs to come from, and that's where the investments into that leadership of urban Indigenous organizations is definitely the way to go. So Miigwech, thank you so much for everyone for being here. I'd like to thank the speakers, the urban sub-working group members who are spoke today, and for the urban sub-working group members that are also here that you didn't hear from today. And wish you all well until we see each other again. So Miigwech. Bye for now, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks, Diane.